Hello, my name is S.K. Williams, and today I would like to talk to you about the Southern Poverty Law Center. You'll have to forgive my voice in this one. I'm not feeling well, and that will cause longer delays in my speech than usual. And don't get me wrong, when I make videos for the tube of you, I often leave long pauses in. This is because of various reasons, but mostly it's to avoid Al Gore and his rhythm. And targeting of the channel for selective outrage. It's all done by Intelligent Synthetica, so even though a human who's listening to this and paying attention would probably know what it is that I'm talking about, it's more difficult for Intelligent Synthetica to do so. Nevertheless, the SPL-C has been fighting racism, discrimination, and forces of authoritarianism coming from the far right for 55 years. They have been champions, progress, social justice, kindness, and building a more tolerant world. Or so they say. In reality, they have been financing the very hate groups that they wish us to fear and that give their organization meaning. They have been paying members of the Ku Klux Klan. They have been paying the Aryan Brotherhood and other white supremacist groups. They even gave $300,000 to plan the event at Charlottesville, the infamous Unite the Right rally, which we are supposed to think of as one of the greatest gatherings of neo-Nazis and far-right extremists. They've been paying for all of them so that they could have an enemy to hate, so that they could gain more money. It's obviously a bit of a grift. It's a con game. It's done to keep that enemy alive so they could have someone to be their enemy, to justify their existence. Which is bad enough on its own, and ridicule is warranted to such actions. Certainly exposing them will lead to both an amusement and a loss of credibility, but I don't really think that the Southern Poverty Law Center is in quite as bad a place as people seem to think it is. At least not yet. The government is involved, and it's being investigated, and it's being indicted, so it may get very bad for them later. But for now, they can weather this. And that may sound odd because they've just been exposed as fraudulent. But you have to realize something that I've been saying for years will come into play. And it goes back to the problem I had with the New Atheism. The New Atheism presented a binary world. You have secular people with no religion who have embraced science and reason, And you have religious people who base their beliefs on faith, who are inherently irrational. And the entire narrative of the new atheism was that faith by its very nature is irrational. It means belief without evidence, just like atheism means a lack of belief in a god, so that atheists aren't actually claiming anything. They're just the default of humanity, because we're all born atheists. We only believe in God because we're indoctrinated by religion. People even today, even who disagree with the new atheism, often accept this framing. But it's a framing rooted inherently in a binary structure, where you have, on one hand, people who are not religious, and on the other hand, people who are religious. And according to the new atheism, if we could just abolish religion, if we could get all religious people to finally give up being irrational and basing their beliefs on faith and embrace reason and science instead, we would have a more peaceful, more tolerant, better world. And a lot of people questioned whether faith-based beliefs were really as violent and deranged as atheists said they were. Some even questioned whether atheists truly were rational. But we kept the general framework that there are two competing camps. There's the secular and then there's the religious. And we accept that atheists are not religious. This entire framing is wrong, because religion and theism are not synonymous to each other. Even accepting that atheists lack belief in a god and totally have no theistic beliefs at all, that would not make them non-religious. Because religion doesn't just mean that you believe a god exists and you worship that god and you believe in supernatural powers. Religion has always been about the beliefs we hold at a foundational level that explain to us the nature of reality, the nature of life, and that provide us with the framework for understanding our existence and who we are within it. Religion can best be understood as the philosophical beliefs that one holds, explaining the nature of our existence. And I know we're supposed to think that philosophy is utterly distinct from religion, but it really isn't. Philosophy and religion are the same thing. We've just created in our minds a distinction that isn't really there. And the modern progressive movement is ultimately a religion. For that matter, so was the new atheism, because the new atheism was never just a group of people who had nothing in common with each other but their lack of belief in a god. That was always never true. That was not actually true. I was about to say a three-letter word beginning with L, but the tube of you doesn't like me saying that word. But the point being is that if you actually read militant atheist literature that comes out of the new atheism, or that comes out of the various organizations related to the new atheism, most of which predate the existence of the new atheism, the new atheism wasn't new. None of its arguments were original, and even the one thing some people who would also point out that their arguments aren't new, most of them would say there was one thing new about the new atheism, and that is their naked, open contempt for religion, whereas historical atheists may roll their eyes but continue. The new ones were hostile. But even their hostility toward religion wasn't new. It goes back to the 19th century, the same place where they got their arguments. And that's because atheism is not just a lack of belief in a god. Atheism is a belief that no gods exist. No one actually defined atheism as a lack of belief in a god in the 19th century, not even people that modern atheists point to as historical atheists who also defined atheism as a lack of belief in a god. Charles Bradlaugh did not understand his atheism as a lack of belief in a god. Neither did Robert Ingersoll. Neither did Bertrand Russell. And I mention those three because it's popular now to quote them to show that atheism has always been defined as a lack of belief in a god. But if you actually look at the quotes used to prove that they understood atheism as a lack of belief in a god, they didn't actually say that. You have to read that into the quote after being primed to accept that atheism is a lack of belief in a god already, and you're reading into the quote something that you want to be there. The truth is, no one understood atheism to be a lack of belief in a god until the presumption of atheism was written in the 1970s. And it was written by Anthony Flew. And Charles Bradlaugh, for instance, saying that he doesn't even know what the word God means is not him saying, I merely lack belief. It is him saying the idea of God is incoherent. And it differs from person to person. But you'll see people quoting Bradlaugh saying, I don't even know what the word God means, as proof that he understood atheism as a lack of belief in a God. It's thoroughly dishonest. But the reason I'm bringing all of this up is because even though we're supposed to accept the other lie, that because atheism is just a lack of belief in a God, that atheists are all over the place politically, and we know that that's not really true. The vast, overwhelming majority of supposedly non-religious people our society identifies as the nons, people with no religion, are progressive. And statistically, if you had nothing in common but a lack of belief in a God, you should be, as the atheists say, all over the place politically. But they're not. They're overwhelmingly progressive. So why is that? Well, the answer is obvious. Their atheism is not a lack of belief in a God. Their atheism ostentatiously is a lack of belief in a God, only to get out of the burden of proof. But these are the people who call people delusional for believing in a magical sky fairy, and who talk about how irrational it is to believe a fictional character from a badly written fantasy novel is real, and who call God people's imaginary friend. People don't talk that way if they just lack belief. They're making clear claims that God does not exist. It's thoroughly dishonest to say that they merely lack belief. But therein lies the problem. Because no one ever just believes that God exists. People have beliefs about God, even if those beliefs are very vague, such as I believe that something created the universe but then stepped away and let it run itself. Deism that is popular to talk about today. They at least have some vague idea about God and some vague idea about the world that he created. And therein lies the point. Atheism is a rejection or negation of theism. It is not a lack of belief. And it's obvious when you have activists for atheism motivated to convert people to atheism. Even though they don't call it conversion, they call it deconversion from religion. They have to emphasize that they're the opposite of religious. So you don't convert to atheism, you deconvert from religion. Well, it's really just conversion to atheism. Convert does not mean to become religious, it means to change. And deconversion from religion means becoming an atheist. It means converting to atheism. They just don't like the word convert because it sounds religious. But that's the whole point. They want to present themselves not just as not religious, but as the opposite of religion. But they're not. They have their own myths. They have their own beliefs. They have their own dogmas. They have their own doctrines. And I'm not saying that it is impossible to be an atheist and to hold different beliefs. But we live in a real world where we are social creatures and we get our beliefs from other people. And the vast, overwhelming majority of atheists today gain their beliefs from other atheists within the skeptic community, a community that named itself the skeptic community, and a community that rests heavily on getting us to think in terms of definitions of words. They supply us a dictionary definition for the word, they apply the word to themselves, and then we have to think about them in the context of those definitions rather than looking at what they actually do in the world and how they actually argue. This is how we know atheism is innocent of all wrongdoing, since no one would ever do anything in the name of what they don't believe. That's why atheism cannot be blamed for the evils of communism, since who would kill in the name of a god they don't believe in or they just lack belief? The communists killed in the name of communism. They did not kill in the name of atheism, as John Brockman said. And I say John Brockman because he was the common source for the new atheism. He was the actual founder of the movement. People don't talk about him nearly enough. But he was the shared literary agent of all four of the four horsemen of the new atheism. And all four horsemen belonged to the same or related humanist organizations, and they were part of the same networks. The new atheism wasn't four separate writers working independently of each other who simply saw the negative effects of religion on society and wanted to write about it and wrote about it on their own. That's the legendary version, but you can't even believe that version seriously if you read their books, because even without knowing that John Brockman was their common literary agent, they reference each other in their books, and they reference various atheist organizations. The truth is that John Brockman had been trying to get an expert-led society off the ground for years via the Edge Foundation, which was financed by a man whose name sounds like Jack Epstein. And the new atheism owed its very existence to the money supplied to it by Jack Epstein. And it owes its existence to John Brockman wishing to bring about that secular world of promise. He handpicked 4 authors to write books that he would then promote, and using his network founded at the Edge Foundation and through humanist organizations and through other organizations, would create a media storm. The new atheism was astroturf. But the new atheism always had its own political bend. It always promoted progressivism while not truth-telling to us, saying that they just lacked belief. But you can't really read these books seriously and think that the progressivism isn't there. It obviously is. At least, it's progressivism from the early 2000s. Progressivism has largely moved on now, and now a lot of atheists have schismed, some joining with the woke movement and becoming what we think of today as progressive, and others standing still. We now largely see those atheists, the ones who broke from the woke, as right-wing, and we talk about the pipeline that led atheism to right-wing politics, but they're not really right-wing, they're not really conservative, they're simply not going along with the additional progressive narrative. And that's something that people don't seem to really understand. The human animal thinks in stories and overarching narratives and archetypes. And atheists are no different. Militant atheists who think in terms that science and religion are at odds with each other, and that there's this war between reason and religion, and that they must fight in order to abolish religion, since religion must die for humanity to live. All of that, as paradoxical as it may sound, is a religious narrative. It may sound bizarre to say that, since these are atheists who hate religion, but they don't really hate religion. They hate their idea of what religion should be limited to. And even there, they contradict themselves. They'll, on the one hand, say that being an atheist means you can't have a religion. Sam Harris once even defined atheism as a lack of a religion. Not just a lack of belief in a God, but a lack of a religion. But then again, Sam Harris also understands atheism as a mere lack of belief in a God with no ideology attached, but he also wrote the Atheist Manifesto. You don't write manifestos if you just lack belief in something. But therein lies the point. They need the lie that they just lack belief in a God to get out of the burden of proof, and it proved to be more effective than just getting out of having to show that God doesn't exist. They don't show evidence for any of their claims most of the time. They just decree something is true, and at best they're simply going to explain something and act as if because they've explained something, that means that what they're saying is proven to be true. You see this quite often with Sam Harris, for example. He will explain that communism had nothing to do with atheism. And after he's given his explanation, you're supposed to set in awe of his brilliance and accept what he said, because he has explained it to you. For some reason, we're not supposed to question the explanations if they're given to us by militant atheists. We are supposed to question explanations given to us by religious people, but never the new atheists. Their explanations are the same thing as evidence. But they're not. Just explaining something doesn't mean that you are telling the truth. But what does all this have to do with the SPL-C? What does it have to do with the Southern Poverty Law Center? Well, the atheist movement, as I said, was always dishonest. It claimed that it was just people who merely lacked belief in a God with no other connections and nothing in common with each other than their lack of belief in a God, while simultaneously running various atheist and humanist organizations, running publishing arms, running anti-Christian campaigns, which, to be fair, were successful. They got America to go from about 90% Christian to only about 60% Christian, with projections being that only about 50% will be Christian in the 2040s. They've been highly successful in getting people to hate Christians and to abandon it, largely because Christians didn't fight back, although that is beginning to change. But no one questioned their narrative. Just like no one really questioned the narrative of the Southern Poverty Law Center. Oh, plenty of people disagreed with it. Plenty of people were upset when the Southern Poverty Law Center would create its hate map and its list of hate groups, and would include on those groups conservative groups like Turning Point USA or James Dobson's the American Family Association, or the Heritage Foundation. All of those were considered hate groups by the SPL-C. And people would tell various different audiences how awful this was, that the SPL-C is identifying us as a hate group, and would point out the disproportionate influence the Southern Poverty Law Center had over people, over government agencies especially. Well, the one thing we didn't question was whether or not they had a hidden agenda. Rather, we thought they had an obvious progressive agenda. We thought that they were simply a group that existed to demonize conservatives. Unless, of course, you were on the left, and then you would say that they're just being honest with the hate. They're fighting the hate. And now it turns out that in order to maintain their own relevancy, they had been paying for the hate. And that's because without the so-called far-right extremism, the Southern Poverty Law Center really doesn't have a reason to exist. No one seriously thinks that we need the Southern Poverty Law Center to fight the radical extremism of Turning Point USA. No one thinks that the Southern Poverty Law Center is needed because without the Southern Poverty Law Center, the American Family Association will take up arms and start blowing up buildings. No one thinks that the Heritage Foundation is just itching to use its militia and its arms to fight some sort of revolution and overthrow the government and create a real-life Handmaid's Tale. No one thinks that. Not really. Even the people who say that would happen don't really think that would happen. They know these groups are largely benign, whether or not they agree with their beliefs or not, that the only damage they could do from a progressive standpoint would be to convince other people to be conservative. But they are not violent extremist groups. That's why the Southern Poverty Law Center had to pay actual hate groups. Because had they not paid them, they would have withered away and largely been extinct. Money makes the world go round, after all. And by the way, if you're a militant atheist listening to this, please don't hyperliteralize my words. I know gravity makes the world go round. I've actually had a militant atheist, when I use common expressions like that, correct me scientifically as if I'm making a scientific statement. But the point being made is that in order to get people to hate and fear Turning Point USA and the Heritage Foundation and the American Humanist Association and the Family Research Council and other more conservative groups, traditional Catholicism, for example, or the SSPX, which is a traditional Catholic group. In order to get people to actually see them as a threat, they have to link them to other groups that people already think of as a threat, groups that have historical legacy attached to them, groups like the Triple K. And I can't use their more normal abbreviation or their full name because of Al Gore and his rhythm and because of the Intelligence Synthetica not liking it. Which ironically proves my point, because other channels can more freely speak than I can on this channel. They really can. And then they use their ability to say these words to prove that I am free to say them. They don't really seem to understand that the two of you is weighted against conservative voices and puts more restrictions on some channels than it does others. They act as if it's all uniform, and it definitely isn't. But therein lies the point. see, weighting the conversation isn't just done with Al Gore and his rhythm. It isn't just done on the two of you or on video platforms or on social media. It's done with news in general. It's done with social perception. People know that the Triple K and that the Aryan Brotherhood and other groups are white supremacist. They know that. And they're associated with violence. And by associating Turning Point USA, the Heritage Foundation, the SSPX, and other groups they don't like for being too conservative or too traditional. Really just too conservative, because progressives think of traditionalism as just conservatism. That's how you generate the threat. Because even if you can't link an actual violent attack to a certain conservative group, the mere fact that they're on the same list with the Triple K and the Aryan nations gets people to be a little more afraid of them and not to listen to them as much. And it works surprisingly well, although it's beginning not to as people begin to become more aware of how dishonest the people are who run these organizations. But therein lies the operational point. You see, and as much as this sounded like a conspiracy theory a few years ago, we've all become painfully aware of something that I've known for years, and I've said for years, and that people like Alex Jones have said for years. And this is why they go after him so much. And don't get me wrong, I've had my own trepidations about Alex Jones. I really have. And I don't agree with everything he says. I certainly don't think that the answer to 1984 is 1776, because 1776 led to our world today. It's why our world is the way it is. But that's the point of embedded mythology. The SPL-C didn't just finance hate groups so that those specific hate groups would continue to exist so that they could justify their existence, but also because the existence of those other hate groups, combined with linking various conservative organizations to them, worked with their propaganda. You see, now, if any one group on the SPL-C's hate list or hate map does anything violent, then they're all tarred. If the Triple K goes to an event and causes a riot and people are hurt or even unalived, well, that tars the Heritage Foundation, because the Heritage Foundation is another far-right group just like the Triple K. It tars Turning Point USA. Turning Point USA is on the same list as the Triple K. They're the same, and if one's violent, the other will be at least in part to blame, or at least we should be suspicious of it, just like we are the other far-right group. The American Family Association. Why should we trust them? Other far-right groups are doing this damage. Look at the Triple K; they're on the same list, and that's how it works. It creates a guilt by association. It generates a narrative that's what those people are like. It lumps them all together and it treats them all as the same. And it works surprisingly well in the same way that militant atheists lump all religion together. They don't really have to talk about any sort of complexity of belief or what a specific belief would lead to. They can just talk about what religion leads to. For years, and this may not be so true after Trump's current war, but for years we've heard about how we know theocracy is bad, because just look at Iran and Saudi Arabia with their no freedom. That's what happens when you let religion run a country. And that's why we have to be wary of the Christian nationalists. They want to create a theocracy in America, and it would be no different in Iran and Saudi Arabia, except it would be under Christian Sharia law and not Muslim Sharia law. But it's all the same because it's all religion. And of course, that's nonsense, because there's more to what caused Iran and Saudi Arabia to be the way they are than just being religious theocracies. Even the term theocracy is actually inaccurate, because an actual theocracy is not a government run by religion. It's a government whose head of state is understood as a god. But we misuse terms all the time. And to us, if a country is run by religion, it's a theocracy, and we know that makes it a tyranny. And a Christian theocracy would be no different than a Muslim theocracy, because they're both theocracy, they're both run by religion, and it would therefore be the same. But that makes no sense when you think about it, because different religions think differently about things, have different teachings, or for that matter, there are even different types of the same religion. The idea that a nation run by Islam must inevitably be like Iran and Saudi Arabia makes no sense, especially when you consider that both Iran and Saudi Arabia were themselves very different countries. They may have both been theocracies in that they were run by religion, and they may have both restricted freedom, but they didn't restrict freedom in exactly the same way. And the difference wasn't just in minor detail. For example, Saudi Arabia is a monarchy, and Iran, at least was, an Islamic republic. Their governing system was very different, and the exact beliefs they held were very different, and what you could and couldn't do was very different. And when you actually look at the supposed white Christian nationalists that threaten to make America no different than Iran and Saudi Arabia because they want to implement a Christian theocracy under a Christian Sharia law, the idea is that should they win, we would be no different than Iran and Saudi Arabia, even though Iran and Saudi Arabia aren't really alike, and that it would be like a real-life Handmaid's Tale. But it really wouldn't, because modern evangelicals tend to merge their religious belief with mythology about America's founding fathers, freeing us from the tyranny of kings to give us freedom. They very much are part of the Western tradition, and they definitely wouldn't outlaw all other religions and all non-religion and institute only their religion as the true one that you have to belong to. They wouldn't promote the strict control that is being predicted over women. They may, of course, outlaw elective abortion, but they're not going to do so because they think women are property and should not have rights and freedom. They would do so because abortion is murder. They may stop recognizing or make illegal same-sex marriage. They may reintroduce prayer to schools. But they're not going to say that if you're Jewish, you're an evil Christ killer and then promote anti-Semitism, because evangelicals are not anti-Semitic. Even with the mythos that Adolf Hitler was a devout Catholic who deeply loved Jesus and got all of his anti-Semitism from historical Christianity. Evangelical Protestants are not medieval Catholics. And it doesn't really matter that, according to the modern atheist religion, that they are the same, because they both follow religion or are both Christian. What matters is what they actually believe. And they actually believe in American exceptionalism and have merged America's founders almost as if the story of America is part of the Bible, with the Pilgrims and the colonies and, of course, the founding generation, where our founding fathers rose up against tyranny and gave us freedom. The Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and the Federalist Papers and all that are effectively just parts of the Bible and sacred scripture to them, and they're not really as antipathetic to Western traditions of individual freedom that we tend to say that they are. You have articles written by left-wingers thinking that conservatives want to end democracy or implement theocracy, but it's all just nonsense, really. But it's necessary nonsense. It's nonsense that gets people on their side to fear the other and to not listen to them, especially combined with a notion that the other side are notorious not truth-tellers. But it doesn't really surprise me that in order to maintain this mythos, this narrative, they require guilt by association. They require things like the SPL-C hate map. They require that sort of thing. And it doesn't surprise me that the media, largely owned by the same people who are promoting the SPL-C, will not be covering the SPL-C's scandal. It will eventually be forgotten because it won't get the media coverage, or at least they hope so. The internet may be changing that, but they are trying to take over the internet in favor of major corporations. At which point the internet will be no different than television. It will be owned by the same 8 or 9 people, at least effectively, and they'll be the only trusted sources of information. And then they could resume their brainwashing efforts. And that's really how it works. On my other channel, I'm going to cover this same topic. I'm going to be clearer there and less meandering. I have to be on this channel, though, because of the nature of my restrictions, but I do find this topic rather interesting and rather important to discuss. But I don't have much else to say now, so I shall take my leave of you. Thank you, God bless, and goodbye.